Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about how your quote-unquote progressive examples of quote-unquote heroes that you see portrayed within entertainment over and over again today are the best examples of villains you could ever wish for. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, is still available on Indiegogo. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for my graphic novel in the background. The link for it is in the description. It is about a man trying to be a true traditional hero. And just briefly, partly why he is seeking to do this is because he examined his life and saw that, no, I thought I was a hero, and I called myself a hero, but really, I was a villain. Or at the very least, I acted in a villainous way. And I want to go back to what is true about being an actual hero. So if that sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. But as I said, today I want to talk about how your quote-unquote progressive heroes are actually villains. And really, the best portrayal of villains that you're ever going to see. And in order to discuss that, I'm going to go in a bit of an odd direction. Because, well, I think if you listen to my videos, you probably know that my mind works on problems. I love having a problem to work on. So I come across something within my week and go, I don't think that's right. And then my mind works on it, usually just in the background, in order to figure out what is going on with this idea. And this is what happened to me a couple of weeks ago when I watched one of the videos from the Lotus Eaters, which is from our old friend Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad, as you may know him. Which means I should have done this video last week, but then I got caught up in doing that Jim Shooter video talking about the impact of Jim Shooter on comics and how comics have changed since he began working on them. And by the way, if you're just here for the comics, please go and watch that video. I will link it at the end and in the description because I think it is one of the most important videos I've ever done about the history of comics. But back to the topic. When I watched that Lotus Eaters video titled, Should We Hate Our Enemies? Which I'll put the link for that in the description if you want to go over and listen to it. It's probably shorter than my video is going to be. But in that video, you have Sargon's, I don't know what you call him, sidekick, and I'm not entirely sure what his name is, Colum? They had a bit of a disagreement. Sargon thought that you shouldn't actually hate anything because it is something that is going to draw you down through your passions into a negative space, into a negative way of acting, and in so much in the fact that hating will lead to something contrary to what is virtuous and a virtuous way of living, which is how you need to actually combat these people, these quote-unquote progressive people who are trying to take over, if not destroy, our civilization today. But you had Coleman on the other side saying, no, it's really rational. You can have a rational hatred. Sure, there is a emotional kind of hatred, but there's also a rational kind of hatred. And while I think that Carl had some good points, in the end, I think he's wrong. I think Coleman is right, exactly right. And I want to explain why. Because it explains what the difference is between a villain and a hero very well, just going through this, because it's an explanation in a roundabout way of what hate actually is. Or at the very least, what hate is according to Western civilization and how our civilization has viewed it for, well, at the very least, 1700 years now. I would say prior to that as well, but in a bit of a modified way, but I'll get into that. So the way I'm going to do this is that I'm going to talk about hatred in an Augustinian way. And I think this is exactly the way that we need to do it because it's based upon the idea of will. And the idea of will that we use today was redefined by Augustine in about the late 380s AD. He redefined for Western civilization what the will actually was. Because prior to that, you had a Greco-Roman idea of what the will was, and the will in those cultures was substantially different. So much so that when I translate things from Greek into English, when I read them in ancient Greek, I can't bring myself to translate things like the future indicative active in I will do this. To me, it's more, I am going to do this. I simply can't do that because I don't think of the ancient idea of will as really equivalent to the modern idea of will, and that modern idea of will that we still use today was defined by Augustine in the late 380s AD. So he's a very influential, extremely influential thinker on all of our civilization. Just by the way, the ancient Greek and Roman way of thinking about will was the fact that there was these larger forces that really controlled your will. You could make choices according to your will, but there were these controlling forces. Forces like chance, like fortune, like fate or destiny, and yes, those are two different things for the Greeks. Forces like Moira, which is your lot in life, or ate or ate, however it is you wish to pronounce it. Forces like your doom, which is the end of your life. All of these larger forces had a very controlling impact upon your will. Now, to bring the idea of hero into it, when you had these great heroes, someone like Aias, or the Latin for his name would be Ajax, within the Trojan War, he was able, by the force of his will, to do something which was outside of his lot in life, outside of his Moira, which is to say, he fought with and injured a god. But of course, the gods had to punish him for that because that was outside of his position, outside of his Moira. You also have similar events where you have Achilles' horses, which were divine. When Achilles died, they started to lament him. They started to speak and to lament the death of their master. And the gods had to strike them in order to say, look, this is not part of your Moira. You can't do that. But you had these extraordinary beings, that is to say, within human beings, these heroic individuals who had such a force of will that they could extract themselves from these larger controlling forces. But they were always there and they always won in the end. But for Augustine, it comes down to choice. It's you have a choice, it is your will, you are making the choice. Now, he directs it towards the good, towards what is true, but the will comes down to you doing something by yourself. There are certainly things that can influence and impact your choice, but at the end of the day, it's you employing your will. And thus, in the end, ultimately making you responsible for all of your choices. And very briefly, if you're not familiar with Augustine and you're familiar with someone like Nietzsche, it's the exact same thing. Nietzsche just stole all of his ideas from Augustine. All he did was take out the truth from the end point of willing. Because for Augustine, the end point for willing was the good, was the true. Whereas for Nietzsche, he said, there is no good, there is no true, there is nothing. You throw back the curtain and all there is a void. Therefore, you should will for the sake of willing and nothing else. Which, by the way, is exactly what Augustine calls evil. But the point for Augustine is that everything comes down to love, even your will itself. As he says, the right will is well-directed love, and the ill will is ill-directed love. And how do you know whether it's directed right or wrong? Well, if you're directed towards the truth, then you're directed in the right direction. If you're directed away from it, that's the wrong direction. And I'll give you a quote from Augustine. It's fairly long, but it explains, I think, exactly what he's talking about. He says, the character of the human will is of moment. He says that because at every moment you can change what you will. But he goes on and says, because if it is wrong, these motions of the soul will be wrong, but if it is right, they will be not merely blameless, but even praiseworthy. For the will is in them all. Yea, none of them is anything else than will. For what are desire and joy but a volition of consent to the things we wish, and what are fear and sadness but a volition of aversion from the things which we do not wish? But when consent takes the form of seeking to possess the things we wish, this is called desire, and when consent takes the form of enjoying the things we wish, this is called joy. In like manner, when we turn with aversion from that which we do not wish to happen, that volition is termed fear, and when we turn away from that which has happened against our will, this act of will is called sorrow. And generally in respect of all that we seek or shun, as a man's will is attracted or repelled, so it is changed and turned into these different affections. And from there he goes on to talk about something which is equally as important. He talks about living according to the truth, for him according to God, because for him God is the truth. And he says such a man ought to be a lover of good, and since no one is evil by nature, but whatsoever is evil by vice, he who lives according to God ought to cherish towards evil men a perfect hatred, so that he shall neither hate the man because of his vice, nor love the vice because of the man, but hate the vice and love the man. For the vice being cursed, all that ought to be loved and nothing that ought to be hated will remain. So here's the thing about Augustine and his laying down of what the will is. You can see from this passage itself that when he talks about emotions, when he talks about your passions, they are subject to your will as well. Quite honestly, the way he puts it is, they're nothing other than will. When your will moves you away from something that you do not wish to happen, that's fear. When it moves you towards something that you do wish to happen, that's desire. And if you take that into the realm of hatred, I would say that hatred, according to Augustine, is very similar to fear. Fear is the will moving you away from that which you know is going to hurt you. Hatred is the will moving you away from that which you know is wrong. And yes, to some extent, that involves a closed mind. There are things you need to close your mind on. I'm sorry, but 2 + 2 = 4. My mind is closed on that. To say otherwise is error. If you try to redefine what you are talking about in order for it not to be 4, then you're not talking about mathematics, because the definition of mathematics is the assumption of all these fixed definitions of what make it up. Therefore, if you change those definitions, it's not math anymore. Therefore, 2 + 2 = 4. And similarly, evil is something to be despised and hated. And as Augustine says right here, he who is evil by vice. What is vice? Well, it's the opposite of virtue. Virtue is what is. It is the truth of human existence, on a large scale of how human beings actually exist, according to prudence, according to justice, according to fortitude and temperance. But vice itself is contrary to nature itself. It is the pursuit of things which aren't true, which aren't real. And evil is the product of the pursuing of that which is not real and that which is not true. And at the same time, it would have to necessitate the shunning of what is actually real and true. And again, as he says here, for an evil man, you ought to love the man and hate the vice, because the nature of the man is actually good. It is the nature of the vice that is actually bad. Therefore, love the man and hate the vice. By the way, this is something that quote-unquote progressives hate with a passion. They will not accept the idea of love the sinner but hate the sin. Why? Because they believe their actions and who they are in themselves are one. And the reason for that I'll get into in a little bit. But here's the thing. Here's the assumption that Augustine makes, and really most of Western civilization makes up until about 500 years ago, when it started to crack a little bit and has spread its error more and more into our civilization until we have what we have today. His assumption is, and the assumption of all the ancients and the medievals, is that mankind, man himself, by his nature, is a rational animal, is a rational creature. That is the definition of man itself, a rational creature. And that our nature is, we are rational, rationality controls, and your passions are the servant of the reason. Now, according to many different sources from Western civilization itself, man is broken, so that there is a chance that your passion can override your reason, and that is something that leads you into error, because that's not the way you're supposed to exist. It can happen, but it shouldn't actually be that way. That is not how you are meant to exist. You are meant to exist where your reason is the master and your passions are the servant. And this is one of the things I'm always talking about when I'm talking about virtue. Virtue, if you wish to build up those virtues, first you need to have right reason. Reason in accord with reality. That assumes that you can understand reality and your place in it, and that assumes that your reason can be in control, and that it is meant to be so. And so it is with Augustine and his description of the will, and his description of placing your love on something and moving away or towards it. It is you understanding, according to your reason, what is going on, and making that willful choice to move towards or away from the thing that you think is right or wrong. It's all based upon the idea that man is a rational creature. And so this is where I think Karl is actually making his mistake. He thinks that hatred is something that is opposed to virtue, whereas I would say that Western civilization says differently. Western civilization says, no, you shouldn't hate your enemy, but you can divide your enemy into the nature of the man and the nature of his choices. And you can love the man and then hate the choices, hate the vices, hate that which is an error. Why? Because A, vices deserve to be cursed. They deserve to be hated. They deserve to be despised because they are error, because they are falsehoods. And B, it is a rational thing to do so. It's based upon a rational principle and a rational movement of the will. Now, here's where I think Karl is going wrong. Listening to Karl for a while, I see that Karl has a bit of a blind spot. And I would say that bit of a blind spot is England. Now, I say this knowing full well that I myself might have a blind spot that I don't even know about, and that blind spot would probably be America. But Carl's blind spot is that he accepts English things a little bit too readily, in a way that's lacking just a little bit in critical thinking. And his acceptance of the ideas of two of the greatest English thinkers, which would be Hobbes and Hume, is part of this. Because Hobbes and Hume are really the origin, the popular origin of the idea which has led to the destruction of viewing man as a rational creature. Because for Hobbes and Hume, their idea was that, yes, mankind does possess reason, but really, his nature is that his passions are in control and that the reason is the servant of the passions. The reason only serves to fulfill your passions in a more effective way. He's also a bit of a Stoic, which if you read Augustine, you will see that his definition of the will, which we still use, is a contrary position to that of the Stoics. Because his position is that all things, including all emotions, can be both positive and negative. You can have a good love and a bad love. You can have a good fear and a bad fear. You can have a good hatred and a bad hatred. It depends on whether you're turned towards the truth or away from the truth, whether these things are good or bad. Whereas the Stoics would say, no, some of these emotions are bad in themselves and we should never use them. But anyway, to go back to the more modern version of viewing mankind not as rational at his core, but as passionate, this is something that destroys everything that Western civilization is built upon. And this is something that your quote-unquote progressive people actually accept as one of the core tenets of their ideology. Their idea is that the passions control. And this is the way that mankind is rightly built. And here's the problem with that mindset. The problem is that with Augustine, everything comes down to the will. You have a choice. It is your act of will that moves you from one place to the other. And that is based upon the idea that you're a rational creature. But if you're not a rational creature, your will has nothing to do with it. You are going back to that idea, that old Greco-Roman idea, and even prior to that, I would say into the very dark recesses of that, where it is more and more controlling, whereas your passions simply are. You don't understand them because the reason does not precede them. You don't know exactly what they are, and you don't have control over them. They control you. They are a force of nature, a power that you have no control over. And in such a mindset, you cannot praise or damn anybody. It doesn't matter if they're a saintly individual, someone like, let's say, Mother Teresa. It doesn't matter. You can't praise her because she's just fulfilling her passions, and she did so well. But those passions were something that controlled her. She didn't control them. And likewise, you can't damn or hate or call evil any of the greatest mass murderers within history. If you look at Stalin or Mao, you can't say, well, we should condemn that. You can't do that. Why? They were just following their passions. They just did so in a very efficient way. They had no control over it. You can't blame them. And so it is, within this quote-unquote progressive mindset, you can have the justification of the most horrific things in the world, and the most horrific actions by people that could be imaginable. Why? Because it's not their fault. They didn't will to do so. It's their passions in control. They're just acting according to their nature. And furthermore, as such, if your passions do precede your reason, then really, you can't understand things objectively. You can't understand the world objectively or know it objectively, and you certainly can't understand other people and what they think. You can never know what a person thinks or what they're going to do. And again, you can't know that through an objective understanding of reality either. If you both understood reality in the same way and therefore were able to develop, let's say, a language that is objective based upon that reality, then you would be able to understand exactly what they're doing. But you can't understand exactly what the other person is doing. You can't understand it because their passions are something which are just, again, a force of nature. And by the way, this is one of the fundamental reasons why this mindset destroys all civilization, not just Western civilization. Because if you can't understand anybody else, it doesn't matter how close they are to you. It doesn't matter if it's your wife or your husband or your children or your parents or anything else. If you can't fundamentally understand what they're going to do, understand how they think or what they believe, if you can't understand all of that, if you can just think that their passions are going to run amok and you don't know what exactly that is because you can't understand them because there's no objective reality to understand them by, then there is absolutely no way you can trust them. Because their passions could say in the next moment, I'm going to stab you in the back, figuratively or literally. You don't know whether that's going to happen or not. And if everyone around you, no matter how close they are to you, might kill you, stab you in the back at every moment, you can't trust anyone. And if you can't trust anyone, there is no civilization. And if there is no civilization, what do we have left? Well, we have left what exactly the quote-unquote progressive people want to bring about. You have power dynamics. That's it. The only way that you can live with other people and ensure that they're not going to kill you whenever they wish, whenever their passions instruct them to do so, is for you, as an individual, to have power over others. And this is exactly what you get in the end. If my passions say one thing and your passions say something which interfere with mine, well, it depends on which one of us has the bigger stick. And so he who has the bigger stick wins out in the end. He who has the more power wins out in the end. And I will get to fulfill my passions over yours because I have more power. Or if I have other individuals around me who I believe, who I sympathize or empathize with, that is to say, understand them through feeling, which is passion and not real understanding, if I can say we're moving in the same direction and therefore we will gather together as a community, as a tribe, we will have more power than your tribe. And that's just the way it's going to be because we are in control. We can take our power and amass it together, and we will control you. And this is exactly the mindset of your quote-unquote progressive person. But this leads to a number of things. Number one being that if you don't believe that you can have an actual rational hatred, that is to say, a hatred of things which are false, of things which are evil, and that is something which is linked to the virtues, then I'm sorry. You've already lost. You've lost to these quote-unquote progressive-minded people. Why? Because that's a mindset which says passions precede the reason, and passions are the master, and your reason is the servant. And that is one of the fundamental tenets of their entire ideology. Because it leads to a position where all that you have is power dynamics, and their entire ideology is built around a manipulation of power dynamics so that they come out on top. They will manipulate it in the subtlest, most dirty way possible because that's, at the end of the day, what their entire ideology is based upon. It's a rigged game where they always come out on top. It also robs us, who are opposed to this quote-unquote progressive ideal, of the greatest weapon that we have, and that weapon is the truth. It reminds me of an old saying, or a short fable, I don't even know which one it is, which basically says, the truth is like a caged lion. If someone is attacking that lion, you don't defend the lion, you simply unlock the cage. And this is extremely important because I have so many people saying to me, look, I can't get entangled in this culture war. I have too many things to do myself. I can't pile on another thing and try to fight these people. Well, the great thing is you don't have to fight them. The only thing you gotta do in order to make their ideology crumble is simply when you express yourself, when you speak the truth. But if you don't have the truth, and you admit to the fact that you cannot know the truth, and there's only power dynamics, what does that lead us to? It will bring us back to something that preceded what you see within Western civilization. It will bring us to a revenge culture, Because if you believe there is nothing but passions that are in control, all there is tribalism. All there is your tribe and my tribe. I have more power, my tribe has more power, therefore we win. There is no I'm on the right side. There is no we have reality that is backing us up. It's my tribe against your tribe, and therefore he who has the more power wins. And it brings us back to a type of tribalism where there is nothing but revenge. There is nothing but a revenge cycle. Whereas you have something like the Hutus and Tutsis within your African history, whereas you have two tribes that live in the same place, and when one tribe gains more power, they slaughter the other tribe in the most horrific way possible. And when the tables are turned, the same thing happens again, and again, and again, and again. This is the exact thing that Western civilization extracted itself from in order to become something unique. It goes back to the expression within both parents of Western civilization, Jerusalem and Athens, or more broadly, Greece. Within Jerusalem, it was expressed within the book of Job, which we don't even know when it was written, and within Greece, it was expressed within the trial of Orestes, which was about 1200 BC. Both of these events were saying that, look, what you actually willed is more important than the actions themselves. Whether or not you put your will upon what was right or what was wrong, that is the core that we need to look at. And again, it's based upon the idea that mankind is a rational animal and that you can choose to do these things outside of these larger forces which control you, and it is ultimately your will which controls. And once you get into that mindset, when it is your will that controls, and you willed this thing to happen, and something bad came of it, but you didn't will the bad thing to happen, then you can say, look, I understand something horrible happened, but I will not take revenge against you for it. I will not punish you for it, because you didn't directly will it to happen. And that is how we've extracted ourselves from the revenge cycle that plagues mankind even to this day in many parts of the world. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking to yourself, I thought you were going to talk about villains and how to construct a good villain. Well, I think I have. In talking about hatred, in talking about the will, in talking about the motivation of why people do the things that they do, and how you can hate things in an evil way and in a good way, I think I've described exactly what we see on the page with these quote-unquote progressive heroes right here and now. I think the easiest example for me would be Magneto from Marvel Comics and, of course, the MCU. Magneto as a villain, when he was an older villain, back in the 60s and 70s, he was a villain. He was a villain because he acted on his passions, and nothing more than his passions. And he was defeated all the time because cooler heads prevailed. You had these heroes who were true heroes, and were basing their heroics upon an understanding of virtue that came from reason, and their cooler heads prevailed, and so they were able to defeat him because they were more rational and understood things in a way that this man who was controlled by his passions could not. But within the 80s, you had Magneto become a hero. Why? Because he started to understand things rationally. He started to have the capacity to say, I understand what these people did to me is wrong. I understand what these people are doing to mutant kind right now is wrong. But flying off the handle, allowing my passions to control me, is not the way to extract ourselves from this. Again, it would just lead to a revenge cycle. But after that point, and what we get today, is Magneto being the most complex and the most sinister of villains that you could ever imagine. And the thing is that every mutant within the Marvel comic system right now is exactly the same as Magneto. They are characters that justify supremacy of one race, wherein they have their island, where if you are a mutant, and the only way you're defined as being a mutant is by your powers, if you don't have powers, then you're either exiled from the island or you die. Now, by the way, they have a resurrection protocol where you can be resurrected and your powers are back, and that's what they want with killing you. But at the end of the day, it's either if you don't have power, if you're not one of us, you either leave or die. This is a supremacist, segregationist kind of thinking. And I get people over and over again in my comments when I talk about the X-Men saying, well, what do you want them to do? They were persecuted and hated by people of the human race throughout their history. Obviously, they should be doing this. I'm saying no, what they should be doing is looking at things rationally and saying, this is just going to lead to more of the same. But they don't care about that. And the writers for these characters don't care about that either. The writers for these characters are firmly ensconced in the idea that all of the actions of these individuals, like Magneto, are justified. Why? Because they're simply following their passions. And whenever some higher idea of rationality rears its ugly head into the story, they push it aside. Literally, they say, that's not important because it's not practical. Again, not practical. You see, the passions are in control. The reason is only there in order to practically get you from point A to point B so that you can fulfill your passions. And so the perfect villain is these quote-unquote progressive heroes, because they do use their rationality, but they use it in a cold-blooded way. They use this cold-blooded rationality to extract what they want according to their passions from everyone and anyone. This is the entire reason why the mutant nation of Krakoa actually exists. It's all down to power dynamics. They said to the world, look, we have these Omega-level mutants, and an Omega-level mutant is basically someone who could destroy the Earth if they wish to do so. We have so many of these people, therefore we have the power, therefore you are under our control, and you will do what we say. And this justifies all of their actions, including invading other countries, violating their borders willy-nilly, stealing people, and that would include children, away from the people who are in charge of them, etc., etc., etc. And again, in the stories, they justify all of these actions by saying what is fundamentally, look, we're just getting back at humanity because they did the same to us. But we have the power now, so we are, supposedly, justified in doing so. But at the end of the day, what does this entire thing come down to? It all comes down to the will. It is these people saying to themselves and to the world around them, very simply, I will what I will, and damn the consequences. And that, my friends, is truly a villain. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, the link for it is in the description. It is a story about a man trying to be a true hero, trying to work against those vices which brought themselves into his life, and which he now hates and shuns. And if any of that sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. All right. I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.